Coming up, a former top recruit's apparently leaving Florida, a potential tough choice for Vols fans, and a big preview of the new coaching staff at Auburn. It's all on the way next, right here on SEC Country Live. Hello, everybody. Welcome into this edition of SEC Country Live in our brand new time slot. New spot here on the calendar every Wednesday at 3 p.m. on the SEC Country Facebook and the SEC Country Live YouTube pages. Great to have you with us as part of today's program. As I said before, a lot on the Vols before we're done. Some interesting stuff about a former big-time recruit leaving Florida. We've got Alabama stuff today. Nick Saban having talked recently about his new quarterback, Bryce Young, or at least the one we assume will be a starting quarterback this upcoming year. Georgia potentially dodges a bullet when it comes to injury. We're still learning new information about that. Two special guests on the way, including in just a moment, Stan White, the former quarterback at Auburn, terrific radio analyst there on the Tigers radio network. He'll talk to us about what Brian Harston and those new coaches are looking to usher in on what they call there the loveliest village on the plain. So that's all on the way. I do want to begin with this, though. Very interesting article up at ESPN.com as Florida has its pro day here this week about Marco Wilson, the former Florida defensive back, who did make a decision to return to Florida there in 2020 and was also involved in what was arguably the most infamous moment of the college football season, certainly in the SEC world, as infamous as you can possibly be. LSU fans loved it. Florida fans hated it. Almost everybody else that wasn't a Gators fan or a Tigers fan, they were certainly entertained by it all. It was the shoe throw heard around the world late in the game there, the shoe throw by Wilson, that led to the LSU victory there in a very foggy swamp there that night. Well, Wilson, speaking to NFL personnel folks here this week in Gainesville, but also speaking to some reporters about what happened there this past year in that kind of what would seem to be almost an embarrassing moment for Florida and for Wilson himself. If you're looking for a huge level of contrition from Wilson, you're not necessarily going to get that. I want to show you this quote here that ESPN.com obtained from Marco Wilson talking about the scenario. Once again, if you're looking for an apology, you didn't get it. He says, in that type of energy, what did people expect? Like I was going to hand it back nicely to him? I was super excited and I threw it. I didn't purposely do it. It was just a reaction. It went pretty far. I mean, I didn't think it would go that far, but it did. That's the former Florida defensive back Marco Wilson, as quoted there by ESPN. And you know, to me, this is as Florida gets in terms of the kinds of things that Gators players sometimes are just sort of allowed to say. Now, listen, a lot of folks know I do Dog Nation Daily. My day job when I'm not doing SEC Country Live, I'm talking Georgia football. People kind of know me as kind of a Georgia guy here a little bit. But you got to understand something. Just take a look at the set that's around here. We're working very hard on SEC Country Live to cover all the SEC teams. In fact, it's kind of always been our house style around here. The two teams that were in the SEC championship the previous year, they get the top billing treatment just above our screen here. So there's a lot of Gator representation here on the wall here back behind me, and obviously on the show there as well. But I think if you're a Florida fan, though, speaking objectively as I possibly have the ability to do, if you're a Florida fan here, this is not necessarily the kind of quote you like hearing, right? This is not necessarily the kind of thing that you sort of wish a guy would say, right? I mean, if you make a decision like this that ultimately costs your team a game, and let's make no mistake about this decision by Wilson, the thrown shoe, everybody knows it, everybody's laughed at it, everybody's had their fun with it. You know, the fact that even in the aftermath of all of this, you can't look at that and say, hey, you know what? Maybe I shouldn't have thrown this shoe. Wilson says, what did you expect from me? I think the thing that we expect from you in this particular case is don't do something that costs your team 15 yards. Don't do something that leads to that kind of decision. But that's kind of the atmosphere that Florida has cultivated amongst its players for a long time. And it's one of the things that I do think is really interesting about the kind of current era of Florida football we're in right now. You know, Dan Mullen is, as a coach, someone who I would kind of describe from a personality standpoint, a very stark difference from some of his predecessors there. Urban Meyer, who was seemingly very comfortable in his own skin and kind of probably viewed as, certainly by non-Florida fans, a pretty substantial villain there around that program, and he didn't seem to mind that whatsoever. You know, Meyer was filled with self-confidence. Sometimes that self-confidence came oozing out in a way that non-Florida fans didn't really like, but he was winning at a very high level. Florida fans obviously loved him, at least until right there at the end when he left the program. That kind of seems to be a little bit of a pattern with Urban Meyer. But the point is, there was no lacking for self-confidence in Meyer. Players many times take on the personality of their coach, and that was obviously the example of that. Prior to Meyer, the other very big coach in place there at Florida was clearly Steve Spurrier. Spurrier was a much more outspoken personality than even Urban Meyer was, and was clearly one of those guys that kind of led from a level of self-confidence and really kind of ushered in kind of a modern age for the SEC. Prior to Steve Spurrier, coaches were sort of speak softly, carry a big stick, and, try to run the football, play defense. Steve Spurrier was about something totally different than that when he came to Gainesville, Florida, and once again, players kind of took on the mentality there of that coach. And I think when we think of the typical Florida player since then, that kind of brash, big talk, willingness to, gonna go out there and play with almost a little bit of a cocky edge to them. That's kind of what we think of when we think of Florida players. But there is also a way in which that can kind of be taken too far a little bit too. And unfortunately, what you have kind of seen in sort of the post-Urban Meyer world for Florida is kind of an edge to some Florida players that's not always backed up on the football field. And kind of sometimes a brash level of talk and a brash level of, persona that sometimes you almost wish, could be validated more by some big wins. Wilson was obviously a very good player at Florida. No one denies that. But when he kind of shrugs off the thrown shoe that cost Florida dearly going into an Alabama game in the SEC championship that the Gators actually played pretty well in, when he says, hey, what do you want me to do? As I said before, I think for a lot of Florida fans, they would say, we want you to not to throw the shoe. That's kind of what we want to do there. But if you're a Florida fan or a non-Florida fan, just an SEC fan in general, make sure to weigh in on this topic in our comment sections there on SEC Country on Facebook and on SEC Country Live on YouTube. We'll continue to talk to you guys all day long about that as we are with you here. As I promised a moment ago, we're going to get Stan White, the former Auburn quarterback. A lot of new coaches there at Auburn. Brian Harsin as head coach. Mike Bobo now as offensive coordinator. Derek Mason taking over as defensive coordinator. We're going to talk to Stan White, who's called these games on the radio for a long time, who knows the landscape of that Auburn program. We're going to talk to him about a lot more of that coming up before we're done today. And, by the way, also special guest here coming up, too. Bottom of the hour here, Mr. College Football himself, Tony Barnhart, going to be on hand to look at the competitive landscape in the SEC West right now. Is there a program, be it Texas A&M, LSU, whomever else, is there a program that can challenge Alabama right now in the SEC West? Tony will tell us about that. How about the big showdown that has existed in the SEC East the last couple of years between Georgia and Florida? Tony Barnhart also going to address that there as well. That is all on the way before we're done here today on SEC Country Live. Let me also get you this here just for a moment. So, and I think this is the kind of thing that's probably going to be a part of our comment section all day long as we're above the fold here on SEC Country Live, looking at the big news of the day. I saw a very interesting tweet the other day from Matt Wyatt. Matt is a former Mississippi State quarterback. He's also been one of these analysts that's done a lot of work on the radio over the years, doing a lot of stuff on YouTube. And he's a credible voice when it comes to talking in the SEC. Well, Matt Wyatt put something out on Twitter the other day that I thought was very interesting, that's at least worth a little bit of our attention here today on SEC Country Live. I want to let you see this from the Mississippi State radio analyst himself. This is what Matt put out on Twitter this week, saying, I'm hearing that the SEC is likely going to have a new football scheduling model / rotation sometime within the next 5 years, Wyatt says. It's unclear if it will involve a reshuffling of divisions, but it will create more frequent rotation among all the league schools. This has been ongoing now for a long time. There's a lot of talk amongst fans about this, and really some folks within the media about the desire to see the SEC adopt a different kind of schedule where you don't play so many of the same teams so often and so many other teams so infrequently. I'll give you an example. I mentioned Georgia a moment ago. For those of you that know me from Dog Nation, that's a team that I obviously have talked about on that show for years and years and years and followed my entire life. Georgia has only played Texas A&M once so far since A&M came into the SEC in 2012. That game was in Athens. They're still not scheduled to go to College Station for another couple of years, even after A&M has been in the SEC since 2012. So that's just one example of what there are a lot of some of these SEC teams that don't play each other very much. And Matt Wyatt says, I'm hearing that's going to change. Sometimes the phrase that gets used to describe this kind of pod systems where instead of 2 divisions with 7 teams in each division, you divide teams a little bit differently so you're playing a small number of teams each and every year and then rotating heavily around the rest of the SEC. Some fans like this. I don't get the impression that necessarily that many higher-ups, executive types within the league, whether it be athletic administrators or, conference-wide administrators. I don't get the impression that that's necessarily all that popular with them necessarily, but Matt says he hears this coming down the pipe here, coming up over the course of the next 5 years. Here's what I'm going to say about this, and this is truly something I want to hear discussion about in our comment section all day long today. I know a lot of folks would like to see a little more parity in the SEC schedule, see certain teams play each other a little more frequently than they currently do. That is not something I am necessarily a big fan of. I think the SEC, in comparison to the ACC, which has divisions, but no one really knows which teams are in which divisions because they're not drawn up geographically. The Big Ten, which has divisions, they are geographic divisions now, but no one really knows anything about the Big Ten West because those teams typically aren't as good as what the Big Ten East teams have been. So there's not a lot of cachet to either of those two divisions. I think what the SEC has actually done is kind of pretty impressive. They have created a distinctly different identity for both of its divisions. And by the way, at different times and different moments in history, one division has totally dominated the other. Over the course of the last however many years you want to go back, the SEC West has been the SEC division that has had the upper hand here. But over the course of like the 90s, when the division situation first got going in the SEC, it was the SEC East that was dominating all that. It was Florida, it was Tennessee, and it seemed like the SEC West was going to struggle to ever win. Obviously after Alabama at the very beginning of the run there. But after that, it was a lot of Florida, it was a lot of Tennessee, there was a lot of SEC East level dominance, and all of a sudden now those situations have been completely reversed. The point is, being in the SEC East kind of means something, with the exception of Missouri, that's way out west, and that probably should be rectified. But being in the East kind of means something. Sometimes it means something good. Sometimes it doesn't mean something good. But it always kind of means something. The SEC West, much the same way. There was a while, way back in time, in which that division was probably a little nondescript. You didn't have big personalities there. But over the course of the last 10 years or so, certainly the last 5 or 6 years, that's definitely changed. So my advice to the SEC would be very careful about getting rid of something that has worked really well for you in the past, and to create more schedule parity at the expense of some of these teams that play every year and actually develop really big histories and rivalries with each other. Don't discount how valuable that can truly be. That's my advice to the SEC. I'd love to have a lot of you weigh in on that today, both here on the Facebook comment section and the YouTube comment section. In fact, before we move on with the show, let's take a moment to check in on that right now. Joyce Dugan checking in on the Facebook comment section. Good to see you there, Joyce. Earl Smith kind of checking in here today there as well. Good to see that. David Arthur says it's literally one or two players always talking out their necks. He's going back to the Florida conversation before. He says when the others just want to kind of come out there and work. And that may be true for the situation at Florida. But certainly it seems like, for a team that won a division for the first time in 2020, going back to 2016, the last time you have to go back to kind of find that? A team that hasn't won the SEC since 2008? Am I doing the math there right? Seems like some of that Florida swagger still left over for a team as of yet that hasn't necessarily backed that up on the football field. So we'll kind of keep talking about all of that. Kent Caldwell, good to see you checking in there. Roy Shivers checking in to say, I think the throwing of the shoe was a selfish, childish act, Roy says. I will take my ball and go home mentality. Said he cost his team. So Roy clearly not happy with Marco Wilson on all of that. Richard Duncan says it's entitled youth. They're going to continue to act out as long as society allows it to be the norm. So Richard not too happy about any of that there either. Gina O'Neill checking in to say, where in the rules of football does it say it doesn't go your way? Throw a shoe. You apology for losing. I guess at the very least, I'm kind of with Gina on that point of, can you at least show a little humility and at least be a little bit upset about the fact that you threw the shoe, you cost the game, and you've kind of made Florida kind of a laughing stock throughout all of that? Can you at least do that just a little bit? So we'll keep those comments going. We're also, as promised, going to get a big preview of Auburn here just for a moment. But before I do that, let me just squeeze this in here really quick as a way of kind of fueling the comment section a little bit more before we get there. Our buddies over at Saturday Down South shared this on Twitter here this week from a website that's got some early season win totals for the upcoming season. Let me get you thinking on this a little bit. We'll get more of your comments. Let me show you these here really quickly, and we'll kind of roll through this as the program goes along. You've got Bama and Georgia both at the top, according to the Hourglass. 10.5 wins, the expected total for them coming season. LSU, A&M after that at 9.5. Florida, the team we were just talking about before, they are at 9. Tennessee's at 7.5. Ole Miss at 7. Auburn with a new coaching staff at 6.5. Arkansas at 6, one of the surprises from a year ago. Mississippi State coming in there at 5.5. That courtesy of the Hourglass, some season win totals for you to pay close attention to. We'll talk more about those coming up throughout the show. You can react to that here in our comment section on SEC Country Live. But for now, as promised, a guy that does a great job covering these games for the Auburn Tigers on the radio, former Auburn quarterback himself, a guy who's been around that program for a long time and knows the scene there, what they like to call the loveliest village on the plains. Let's get ready to welcome in Stan White, the former Auburn quarterback here, who joins us on SEC Country Live. Stan, thanks for your time this afternoon. We really appreciate you being with us, and I certainly hope you're doing well.
My pleasure, my man, and just enjoying this nice rainy weather over here in Alabama today, but everything's fine.
I think it's a mess around a lot of the South here today. I know in Georgia where I live, it's very much the same way. I think for a lot of our audience, they're trying to take cover here with all of this. Hey, before we move into Auburn specifically, I want to get your opinion on something else that came up on the show a moment ago, which is the rumors, and they never die down this time of year, that, hey, maybe the SEC might change its schedule format at some point in time, go away from the division format. I know specifically where you are there at Auburn, there's maybe been some rumblings amongst fans. They wouldn't mind being out of the SEC West, a little bit more closely geographically aligned with some of the teams in the East. Would you ever be in favor of kind of a radical readjusting of the SEC schedule, and could you ever actually see the SEC doing something like that?
I could see it happening. I'm a big fan. When they went to divisions, unfortunately, Auburn lost some really good rivalry games every year. Tennessee being one, Florida being another. I mean, when I was playing, we played Florida every year. And Steve Spurrier, we had some knockdown dragouts, and of course Tennessee as well.
Did we lose? We'll see if we can get Stan back on the phone there. Good conversation going.
I think it makes sense in the fact that it kind of keeps everything energetic and exciting. If you look at just geographically, obviously Auburn is further east than Vanderbilt and clearly Missouri. But I still like playing A&M and of course Alabama every year, obviously, and LSU. So. I could see a day maybe where it was entertained. I don't know if it'll happen, but where it may be entertained, where you say, okay, would it be best to go away from divisions, maybe add a conference game, having 9? And I do agree that I think you should have the opportunity to play every single team in your conference before you leave that school. And right now, it's just not happening. I love playing against Florida. I love playing against Tennessee when I was at Auburn, and oddly enough, we played LSU only twice when I was there. Of course, '92 is when they went to the divisions,
sure.
And that was my junior year. But yeah, I could see that happening.
So obviously Auburn's got a brand new coaching staff there with Brian Harsin. You bring in a proven winner there at Boise State. Mike Bobo is a guy that knows the SEC very well. Derek Mason, prior to being a head coach at Vanderbilt, one of the most respected, defensive minds, going back to his time at Stanford and everything else, going through spring practice right now. I know a lot of fans got to see an open practice a couple Saturdays ago. How would you say the new era of these Auburn coaches is kind of rolling out thus far? What's the feeling around Auburn about what Harsin and the rest of his staff are looking to get done this season?
Well, I think there's a lot of energy, and I think there's a lot of excitement. Now, of course, they're 0-0. They haven't played a game yet. So I think a lot of schools with a new staff would have some energy and some excitement about it. A little bit of the unknown, obviously. But I think, the one thing that you'll always hear about Brian and what he brings to the table is the attention to detail. And I kind of I equate it to embracing the process over the prize. And so I think that's what you'll find with him is convincing these veterans on the team, like the Bo Nixes of the world, the Tank Bigsby's, even though he's a true freshman, the Owen Papos, that, hey, look, this is our vision. This is what we're going to do with the program. And then obviously convincing these younger guys that, listen, you have a clean slate. You got a chance to come in here and play and get a lot of playing time. So I think that's the biggest challenge of a head coach and a new staff is getting the buy-in from the older and the younger guys. And from what I've seen so far, I think Brian has really done a fantastic job of kind of corralling those guys in and saying, look, this is the vision we're going to have, and they're really buying into it.
I think the thing that stands out the most to me, and as a former quarterback, you may think this yourself, Bobo's obviously been around the SEC a bunch, having been at Georgia at South Carolina a year ago, but he's really bringing, to my knowledge, a style of football that's pretty unfamiliar to Auburn going back the last several years, and kind of an outlier with the rest of the SEC. Some huddling, maybe playing a little slower than Coach Malzahn liked to play. What does that mean for Auburn fans to see Mike Bobo bringing in an offense that's been successful in the SEC before, by the way, but that's just going to look so dramatically different from what Gus Malzahn and his crop of offensive coordinators were doing for so many years?
If there's one term I would say that you have to have on offense and ever is versatility. You have to be able to line up under center, play a little pound and ground, and you've got to be able to line up in the shotgun and go fast pace. You've got to be able to do all those. So Auburn in years past, several years past, they've had opportunities. They've had some chances where they've been really able to run the ball. You go back to 13 and 14 and those years where they just couldn't be stopped on the ground. And then there have been years where they struggled some in that being versatile a bit. So I think that's the biggest thing that you could take away from what Mike and what Brian's philosophy is going to be, is that they've got to be versatile enough to be able to line up and do a hurry up, no huddle. But also, they've got to be versatile enough to be able to believe and convince these guys that, listen, sometimes we're going to huddle up and we're going to have an 8-minute drive. And so if you can do that, also obviously being able to balance it out, passing, running, then you've got a chance to be successful. So versatility would be the term that I would say every offense has to be able to be successful.
I want to ask you a question about the Auburn schedule, which looks pretty tough to me before I let you go. Before that, let me squeeze one more thing in. Bo Nix is a guy that had a lot of accolades coming out of high school and really has had, some nice moments thus far in his Auburn career, but some moments also where I'm sure he would have liked to have maybe performed better than he did. New coaching staff, kind of a fresh restart for Bo Nix, a guy that a lot of the SEC has gotten very acquainted with. What do you look for from Bo this year, and how big of a year can the Auburn quarterback have?
Well, I think he's going to have a huge year, and I look at Bo's career at Auburn, and it's only been a 2-year career, and his path has been similar to what I went through. And had a good freshman year, a solid freshman year, was all SEC freshman, and then my sophomore year I took a step back. And Auburn was under investigation. We had some transition to me being more of a veteran, even though I was a sophomore. Lost a bunch of players, and of course I struggled at times as well. And then we had a new coaching staff come in my senior year, and of course this is Bo's only junior year, and we were able to go undefeated, and it got my energy back and got my confidence back. I think that's something that Brian and Mike can help with Bo as they transition to a new system where they don't have to rely on him as much, and convincing him that you don't have to go out there and win every single play. And that's one thing. Being a competitor like Bo is, you can tell he wants to win every single play, and it's just impossible to do that. And so being able to reel that in and say, look, sometimes the defense is going to get you. They're going to have you. So, hey, live to fight another day. And I think that's what Brian Harsin, being an ex-quarterback, and Mike Bobo obviously being a quarterback from Georgia, I think they'll help Bo with that maturation process.
Let me squeeze in one more thing before I let you go. I think the Auburn schedule, especially the front end, is certainly, to my eyes, pretty challenging. Big road game at Texas A&M. At Penn State's what I mean to say. Big road game at Penn State, at LSU. You've got an fairly early season road game at Arkansas. Sandwiched in right there with all of that is that home game against Auburn, arguably like the first really big home game of the Harsin era there. I know they're looking forward to welcoming back fans. I would certainly hope at Jordan-Hare Stadium this year. How big of a home game against Georgia is that going to be, knowing that there are so many other road games that kind of populate that early schedule there for a coaching staff that obviously wants to get off to a good start?
Well, obviously, Brian had to do his due diligence and see that you play in the SEC West, which, year in and year out is arguably the toughest conference of all conferences, not just the SEC West. It could probably compete with any overall conference. So, yeah, it's going to be challenging. I'm excited to go to Happy Valley. I've never been to Penn State before in my 20 years doing the broadcast, and four playing, obviously, so that'll be an exciting trip. And of course, Georgia will be the odd one because usually it's in the back end with Alabama, and that's been, murderer's row, so to speak, when you have to go on the road in a 2-week span to play Georgia and Alabama at the end of the year. Typically, Auburn wants to be in that hunt in late October, and those last 2 games have always been either a make or break. When 17, it was a great year. I mean, it was going to be Auburn's first two-loss team in the history of the playoff to be in the playoffs if they win that SEC. course, Georgia wins the rematch. But so I like the fact that it's kind of sandwiched out. But, of course, you take the place with LSU joining in the back end. So I don't know if they did Auburn any favors in that respect. But, yeah, it's going to be a challenge. Every year it is. I'm excited about it. You don't sign up if you're Brian Harsin to coach at Auburn if you don't want that challenging schedule, because year in and year out, you're looking at a top 10 toughest schedule in America.
Well, I'll tell you what, Stan, I appreciate your time on SEC Country Live here today. We love the coverage that you're providing there for the Auburn Tigers. Thanks for helping us get acquainted with what that team looks like for this upcoming year. Hope you enjoy the rest of the spring practice. Stay dry in what is rainy conditions around the South here today, and thanks so much for being with us on the show.
Hey, my pleasure. Anytime. War Eagle, take care.
Good stuff there from Stan White, the former Auburn quarterback. And as I mentioned before, you look at that early season schedule for Auburn. You got like the regular kind of non-Power 5 cupcakes to begin the schedule. Then it's on the road at LSU, on the road at Penn State, early season game on the road at Arkansas. Let me tell you something. We've got a lot of Arkansas fans watching us right now. Arkansas fans, the only thing they hate more than Auburn right now are the SEC officials, because what happened in that game a year ago. If you ever look at on Twitter, there's the SEC officiating Twitter account, which I have no idea why the league even started this, because they don't really use it very well. But like 90% of all the replies to every tweet that's ever gets sent by that account are Arkansas fans still mad about something that happened in last year, and they obviously did have some bad calls go against them. But the point here is that that's a raucous environment for Reynolds Razorback Stadium, hoping to also add fans back. You have very tough games in the early going on the road for Auburn. For Harsin, that new coaching staff, that game in Jordan-Hare with Georgia, you better believe that's a game they want to circle, because honestly, as big a reason as any that Brian Harsin's even employed at Auburn right now is because of the fact that Gus Malzahn, he beat Alabama fairly frequently. Beat him in 19, beat him in 17, beat him in 2013. The one thing, though, that he was not doing enough is beating Georgia. So pretty clearly the measuring stick for Brian Harsin in the early season, especially if you think about tough road games, home game against Georgia, to show that this Auburn staff has a chance to be more competitive there in that spot than the previous administration was able to do. We'll talk more about all that kind of stuff with Tony Barnhart coming up in just a moment. And as I said before, I want to continue to get your comments on a couple of things that I showed you a little earlier. The idea of an SEC scheduling model change that Matt Wyatt suggested, the over-under stuff that the folks at Saturday Down South shared of, the projected win totals of the upcoming season. If you're in our comment sections on Facebook and YouTube, we'll look forward to sharing those with you and doing a lot of conversation about that. Before I bring on Tony, though, I want to look at the Alabama Crimson Tide here for a moment. We'll call this our all-points bulletin. We'll start bouncing around the rest of the SEC here just a little bit. And obviously for Alabama, huge changeover for the upcoming season. As you say goodbye to Mac Jones, who's on his way to the NFL, you say goodbye to Heisman Trophy winner Devontae Smith at wide receiver, Steve Sarkisian, the offensive coordinator that led all that. He's now head coach at Texas. There's a lot of new faces there in Tuscaloosa, all trying to have a big impact, and a lot of attention being paid to Bryce Young, the guy that we expect to sort of step into the void as the Alabama starting quarterback. How are things going for him in these early stages of Alabama spring practice? Well, this week, Alabama coach Nick Saban updated us on that. This is what Coach Saban had to say.
Bryce has made a lot of improvement. I think he's a lot more confident. I think I've talked about this before, that, we wanted to play Bryce a lot more than he got to play last year. I think the situation, the circumstances, playing 10 SEC games, SEC championship game in the playoffs, didn't get as much chance to do that as we've done in the past with, developing quarterbacks. But I think just having all the reps that he had last year, he's much more confident. I think he's doing very well.
I don't think you can gloss over what Saban says there, that when you did not play the Group of 5 FCS level teams, when you didn't do that a season ago, for a lot of these SEC teams, even though I'm not personally a fan of them, I don't like those kinds of games, sort of cupcake, guaranteed win. Sometimes they're called buy games because you essentially pay a team to come to your stadium and let you beat up on them. I don't like those kinds of games, but guys who are backup quarterbacks, they love those kinds of games. Guys who are freshmen fighting for a spot in the 2 deep, they love those kinds of games because those are the moments in which they get a chance to play. And as Saban said, we didn't have those a year ago. And listen, I realize Alabama's the defending national champion, and the respect they've earned is certainly through the hard work of winning titles all these years. But I would not gloss over as a significant SEC storyline when Mac Jones had as good a season as he did a year ago, when Devontae Smith had as good a season as he did a year ago, when Steve Sarkisian did as well as he did in orchestrating that offense all season long. The job of replacing all three of those guys is not an insignificant one. Now, in the case of Bryce Young, you've got as deep and impressive of a prospect in that spot as you could ever have. But it is not an easy thing to replicate offensively what Alabama did a year ago. It sounds like from Saban there, the early going, all of this looks really good. But for the A&Ms and the LSUs and maybe, as we mentioned a moment ago, even Auburn, for those teams that want their glimmer of hope in the SEC West, the fact that Alabama replaces so much offensively is at least some worth of consideration as you're kind of filling out your pecking order there in that division. Let's talk even more about that right now with a guy who knows all of this stuff and has followed this league for a long time. He is Mr. College Football. You can read him on a great website. You've seen him for years on TV. It's Tony Barnhart here on SEC Country Live. Tony, thanks so much for spending a little bit of time with us. Hope you're doing well. And as we were saying to Stan White, the former Auburn quarterback, a little bit ago, very rainy all across the South today. So wherever you are, Tony, I certainly hope you're staying dry.
Well, we're doing our best. We're doing our best, but it's raining. It's raining pretty hard here in Atlanta. But no, it's a good time of the year. We're still in basketball. Spring practice is cranked up pretty good, and and Masters is coming up. So
it's a great time of year to be sure. So, Tony, let me begin with this. I was just talking about Alabama before you joined us, and I think one of the things that we kind of forget sometimes is when Alabama's on top of the world, it sort of seems like they always have been. But the truth is, Crimson Tide have only won the SEC West twice in the last 4 years. You know, LSU got them in 2019. Auburn got them in 2017. They are not bulletproof within their own division, even though they've won, multiple national championships over the course of that same span. So when you look at the outlook for 2021, Bama breaking in new quarterback, replacing a Heisman Trophy winner, replacing an offensive coordinator. Do you see an avenue for anyone else other than Alabama in the SEC West right now?
Right now, Brandon, is Alabama beatable? Yes. But I'm trying to look at the SEC West and say, okay, who can beat them? Is LSU going to improve that much over last year? They'll be better because they were just awful in the first half of last year. So they'll be better. Can Texas A&M without Kellen Mond, can they beat them? They've got two young guys who have hardly played at all at quarterback, but Jimbo Fisher is going to coach them up. So Alabama is, to me right now, when you look at it, when you look at the new offensive coordinator, Bryce Young, incredibly talented, but are they beatable? Sure, they're beatable, but you're going to have to play really well to beat them.
I mean, the team that I would make the biggest argument for there in the West right now is Texas A&M. I think what Jimbo Fisher did a year ago, to me, it looks really real. Obviously, as you said before, you got to replace Kellen Mond, but when you think about a guy like Hayes King or Calzada or whomever else, I mean, Jimbo Fisher's developed quarterbacks before. That's the one thing that we know he can do well. But Tony, when you look at the way that program is playing better defense than they ever did under Kevin Sumlin, when you look at the way they're running the football now better than they ever did under Kevin Sumlin, there's an aspect of what Jimbo Fisher has ushered in there at Texas, at College Station, that to me feels very much akin to what the rest of the SEC has done really well for a long time. They're not as high-powered offensively as some of these other teams are, but in terms of depth of roster, big recruiting success, I mean, to me, I would say right now in the early stages of this 2021 conversation, A&M feels like a fairly real threat to Alabama in my mind.
Well, you touched on it. The running of Isaiah Spiller. Spiller did not get the credit he deserves to be on one of the very best backs in this conference. And they ran the ball first to set up everything that Kellen Mond was going to do, and they played good defense. And you got to do that in this league. I mean, now defense as we know it in the SEC, Brandon, as we grew up, that defense doesn't exist anymore because of the offense. But you redefine what good defense is, and that is getting one or two extra stops a game. And Texas A&M did that. Alabama did that. You look back at Alabama's numbers. They seem high compared to years past, but Alabama played really good defense last year. So, I like Texas A&M too, and it's going to be interesting to see early on how they play.
When you look at the first-year coach in the SEC, we talked to Auburn a little earlier. Because Harson's kind of a proven winner, I mean, not that Josh Heupel's not, but Harson's done it at kind of a high level at Boise State for a while. You think about sort of the typical strength of the team as it is. To me, it looks like he may be in a much better position in the early going than Shane Beamer is at South Carolina, who kind of inherits a little bit of an issue there roster-wise. Tennessee, with the attrition they've had off that roster. I mean, can you make a case for either Beamer or Heupel keeping pace with Brian Harsin in the early going for all those first-year coaches around the SEC?
No, I don't think you can. Let's look at Tennessee. I mean, Josh Heupel has the reputation of developing great passing games, but you got to have somebody who can throw the ball. And the guys they've got have played some, but you know what? They never could beat out Jarrett Garantano, and I think that tells you something. And so, I just don't. And the thing about it is there are teams that can challenge, but right now, I don't see it.
Yeah, I think you're probably right about that. How about the SEC East, where we saw Florida do what they've been trying to do for a couple of years. They got past Georgia a year ago. Obviously, I think most of the preseason prognostications are going to kind of favor maybe Georgia kind of getting back on that just simply because of what Florida lost off last year's team. But one way or another, it sort of seems like we're still heading for that Georgia-Florida showdown in the SEC East. How close do you think it is between those two teams right now? And I guess, can you make a case for Missouri? Can you make a case for anybody else in the East right now?
Well, keep an eye on Kentucky and Missouri. I think the fact that Coach Drinkwitz now has had a spring practice with his quarterback, basically who played well down the stretch. I think Kentucky, if they do some things offensively that they're hoping to do, they made a big change there, letting Eddie Grand go. And bringing in somebody to open up the offense, I think that speaks volumes. But right now, it's Georgia and Florida, and and as far as Florida goes, you got to prove to me, Brandon, that Emory Jones is an every down quarterback. He may be, okay. Dan Mullen may take advantage of his skill set, and which he's done with running quarterbacks in the past, and fashion him into something. I'm still not convinced yet he's an every down quarterback. The defense has got to improve tremendously if they're going to beat Georgia and win the SEC East. Last year was just an awful year for Todd Grantham and his guys. They got to get better.
I certainly noticed, and I think it was eye-opening to a lot of people, how little confidence. I'm not saying he certainly wasn't critical of him, but at the close of the Florida spring practice in terms of evaluating what Jones had done there, boy, Dan Mullen was pretty careful with the words that he chose. He certainly didn't overpraise Emory Jones, and if you're just paying close attention to this, the door for like an Anthony Richardson or somebody else stepping in to maybe get some snaps there at Florida, I think the words that Dan Mullen used seem to kind of leave the door open for that a little bit.
Yeah, it does. It does. And people have told me, Anthony Richardson's very talented. If he can get a little experience, get a little competency. But it's interesting. It is going to be interesting to see how Dan Mullen uses Emory Jones when if he's going to be the every down quarterback. What's the mixed pass to run? Does he have enough confidence in Emory Jones' arm? I don't think Emory Jones has proven to us yet that he can make critical throws in a game. He may do it. He just hasn't done it yet.
So I want to finish with this. We talked about this a little earlier based on something that Matt White, former SEC quarterback, had said on social media this week, the idea that within the next few years the SEC might finally be ready to make a change that some people say they want, which is kind of scrapping the divisions, going to more of like I think the word that's been used, kind of a pod-like thing where you're playing a small number of teams frequently and a larger number of teams on a higher rotational basis. Tony, what I said before you joined us, and obviously your opinion matters in this a lot because you've followed all of these SEC seasons for so many of these years. I like division play in the SEC. I think the SEC's divisions kind of mean something in a way that the Coastal and the Atlantic and the ACC never really have, and the Big Ten East and West kind of never really have because of the fact that they've only been geographic divisions for a number of years. That's not the way that league kind of started. I think there's a distinct personality to the West and a personality to the East, and winning the division, making the championship game, to me still means something. I know a lot of fans want this. Tony, I'm not one of the ones that does, though.
Yeah, I'm not real crazy about that because I'm so old. I was there at the beginning when they went to divisional play, and one of the things that Roy Kramer, the former SEC commissioner, it was his idea. He says, "Look, we want more games to matter in November." Well, if you got divisional play, then you've got two different championships at stake, more games that mean something down the stretch, and it's worked out pretty well for the SEC. You got to admit. Now, the question is, can we come up with a system that allows teams in the other division to rotate through the other division more quickly so that you're not have a 10-year gap between Georgia and Texas A&M, things like that. And I think we're going to have a serious conversation about going to 9 or 10 conference games. Mm-hmm. But I think we've got to find a way to teams to rotate through on a more frequent basis.
We saw Georgia, just to kind of follow up on this real quick, added a home-and-home today with Louisville for 26, 27. So in a lot of these upcoming years, Georgia, like Alabama and some of these other SEC teams, Georgia's got 3 non-conference Power 5 opponents. How does something like that, the aggressive non-conference scheduling, kind of factor into all of this, where there's a desire to play more SEC games but also more non-conference games? It certainly seems like there's maybe not much of a desire right now to see games against Group of 5 and FCS level competition. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it is fair to say, and it's a huge balancing act. Because, look, the athletic directors are hearing it from their fans. Well, two things. Number one, they're hearing from their fans, we want experiences. We want road trips we haven't had before. We want to go places we haven't. I'm telling you, Brandon, the Georgia-Notre Dame game at Notre Dame in 2017 changed everything. It really did, because now everybody's looking, hey, why can't we go to Notre Dame? Why can't we go to UCLA? Why can't we go to Penn State like Alabama's going? So that's number one. Number two, I am not going to pay you $125 to watch you play Western Carolina. I'm just not going to do it. And I think more and more fans are staying home rather than, you got your season ticket holders, but that is an issue. But it's a balancing act. You also got to take care of your coach, and don't ask him to play 12 tough games in a season. So it's a balancing act, and there's one that we're going to continue to talk about. But the trend of good intersectional rivalry games, that is going to continue, because I think, Brandon, we're going to have an 18 playoff here in about 4 or 5 years, and you'll be able to get into the playoff with two. The coaches want to know, if I step out and play this schedule, can I get into the playoff with 2 losses?
Yeah.
And the answer to that question had better be yes, or I'm not stepping out.
Well, Tony, I tell you what, it's so much fun talking college football with you. I certainly appreciate you being here on SEC Country Live here today. For the folks who want more of what you're doing, you guys got a great website that you're putting content on. How can folks find more of you online?
We are under the SI umbrella. It's si.com/college/TMG, and that TMG stands for the media guides, and we're updating content on a pretty regular basis.
Tony, thanks so much for being here. I'll look forward to speaking to you soon, and as I said before, just thanks for your time here on SEC Country Live.
All right, you bet, Brandon.
Good stuff there from Tony Barnhart. Very, very forceful statement about kind of what the future of scheduling looks like. That is really interesting. That's also been a hot topic in our comment section all day long today. So before we get back to our All Points Bulletin and kind of check in on some of the other locations around the SEC, what's going on, let me take a few of your comments right now. I have not been on YouTube yet today, so let me pop over here and talk about that here just for a moment. G. Grace, Bama Boy, was weighing in earlier to talk about the situation with Auburn, and he says, now G. Grace, of course, is an Alabama fan, as his avatar would lead you to believe. He says that Auburn wants to come over to the East because it's weak. That flew over your head. The SEC East is a joke, G. Grace says, so he's going back and forth with somebody. And really, I would say that the only SEC team that I know for sure that does want to change, at least from a fan standpoint, you've heard more rumblings of that around Auburn than other places. And G. Grace may be right, that they may just see an easier path in the SEC East because there are fewer behemoths right now than there are in the other division. But we said this before. Go back to the 90s, it almost seemed like the exact opposite was true. But maybe Auburn does see that. You know, you don't see Missouri, for instance, even though it would certainly aid them geographically being the SEC West. There's not a lot of Missouri fans who want to do that because the schedule gets way, way tougher because you're having to play those SEC West teams each and every week. Mark Morris checks in to say, how about Auburn to the east, Missouri to the west, 9-game conference schedule? This is the only change I'd be okay with. And I'd kind of be okay with that too, even though, look, Georgia's already playing Auburn all the time anyway, so it's not that different if you're a Georgia fan on that. So that's not necessarily that big of a deal. But, that kind of movement, that kind of, shifting around, I'd sort of be okay with. I mean, to me, here are the sort of like cross-divisional rivalry games you have to play. I think you have to play Alabama-Tennessee every year. I think you have to play Georgia-Auburn every year. I'd be very curious to hear, do LSU and Florida fans feel like you have to play LSU-Florida every year? I would say in modern times, that's become a very intense rivalry. I don't know that I grew up thinking about LSU-Florida being some great historical, traditional rivalry, but certainly when I was in the last few years, we've seen like some legitimate bad blood between those teams, dating back to the canceled game and the attempt to move the game around that Joe Oliva was kind of a part of. and everything that's kind of happened since then, the thrown shoe that we started the show with here today. So I'd say there's some real intensity around the LSU-Florida rivalry that probably did not exist a couple of years ago. So interesting stuff from Mark, who's a Georgia fan, kind of weighing in there on that. Back over here on Facebook just for a moment. By the way, Mark Jackson, on the subject we were talking about, season win totals and everything else a moment ago, Mark says he could see LSU winning the SEC West here this year. I gave you that number earlier. Be very, very, make sure you pay close attention to the fact that LSU is right there with a projected total, at least according to the website that we showed you a little earlier, of 9.5 right now. Behind only Alabama and Georgia, right there alongside Texas A&M. There is a lot of chatter out there right now, and I think you should take it seriously. But a bounce-back year for LSU on the way here. Pay very close attention to that. Morgan Recton, who's a Florida fan, checking in to say, the all-SEC schedule was legit. Morgan really enjoyed that, made every week fun to watch. And, Morgan, I would definitely agree with you on that seeing teams playing somewhat equal competition each and every week was certainly an improvement based on kind of what we see a lot of times where like that late November game, or a lot of times it's the second week of the season. There are some weeks when like most SEC teams in the past have just not been playing top flight competition, and this past year you didn't have to worry about that. So that is clearly what I think fans want more of, and we'll see how much they kind of provide on that coming in the years ahead. Brett Strickland checking in to say, BA, do you buy the LSU hype? Not as a division winner. I would probably still rank LSU behind A&M and Alabama, but I'd have Alabama and A&M both rated very high on my preseason list. I think that LSU is probably a top 15 team at the very least here for this upcoming season, and the kind of win total that kind of goes really well for that. We talked about LSU Florida as a crossover opponent a little earlier. Florida being down for the upcoming season, which I believe they will be, I think helps LSU a little bit there. I'm not buying into a lot of like the second-year coach hype right now. Not for Leach. Not for Kiffin. I liked Sam Pittman in Arkansas a year ago. I think it's harder to do this year without Felipe Franks. I think there's some wins to be had on the LSU schedule, so I see them putting a nice record together. I see them being a top 15 team. I probably would rate them behind a Texas A&M team and probably behind Alabama there as well. Let's find out what else is going on here. Terrell Hoyt says, to go back to our opening topic, he says you can definitely throw a shoe. Now you're going to get a penalty for it, but you can throw a shoe, and certainly Marco Wilson proved that a little bit earlier this year. All right, let's continue our all points bulletin here for a moment. Bounce around the rest of the SEC. Good stuff from Tony Barnhart there, and if you missed it earlier in the show, Stan White, the former Auburn quarterback. And if you missed this, last week at this time we were talking about a Georgia wide receiver injury. George Pickens, ACL injury. He's going to be out for really potentially the entire season. A devastating blow to one of Georgia's best players. And then just yesterday, 1 week after the Pickens news came to the forefront, you also find out about another Georgia wide receiver injury, this time Jermaine Burton, second-year player in the program, a guy that had nearly 200 receiving yards when Georgia played Mississippi State last year in the first start at quarterback for J.T. Daniels. A Burton injury to the same level of George Pickens would be devastating to a Georgia wide receiver corps that's trying to upgrade itself and join the rest of the high-powered offenses in college football. Sounds like, though, at least for now, the outlook for Burton is not quite as dire as it was for Pickens a week ago. This is Dog Nation's Mike Griffith, who covers UGA on my program Dog Nation early this morning, to update us on Jermaine Burton.
What we know right now, hyperextended knee, MRI, to this point, no structural damage, and at this point, we don't believe there's a need for surgery. So right now, it's looking like this won't be something that will keep Jermaine Burton out for the season. I do believe he's likely finished for the spring. I think he would do that as a precaution anyway.
So listen, I said this last week, that one of the reasons why we like doing SEC Country Live is because the news that impacts one SEC school also has a big impact on the other. We have a lot of Florida fans checking in. We've been talking about Marco Wilson and what he said, a lot during the show today. Obviously, Florida fans are curious to see, can Georgia build the kind of offense that rivals what Kyle Trask and Kyle Pitts did together a year ago, what the very best teams in the SEC now have done the last couple of years? And the need to upgrade the wide receiver performance is Georgia's way of getting that done. And listen, this group on paper would appear to be deeper than what Georgia wide receiver situations have been, certainly, under Kirby Smart in prior years. But there are only so many injuries you can deal with before all of a sudden that depth is called into question. The Pickens injury, as good as he is, you might be able to overcome that. Had the Burton injury turned out to be as serious, and for now we're left to speculate, but the early speculation is maybe it's not quite as severe. For Georgia, that's a sigh of relief. And for the rest of the SEC, maybe a source of curiosity. Well, what does that mean then for JT Daniels, working with Todd Monken as offensive coordinator here in his second year with all of that? Are they going to get going to the same level that Bama was a year ago, averaging 48 points a game? What LSU did the previous year, averaging 45 points a game. That's what the very best teams in college football are doing right now. They are scoring 40-plus points per game with ease, even against the better defenses that they play. Georgia, as of yet, hasn't done that. That's not been the mode of the Georgia offense. You need good receivers to change that in 2021. Hopefully, if you're a Georgia fan, Jermaine Burton coming back gives you a chance to do that. Speaking of the Florida Gators, as we continue our All Points Bulletin here on SEC Country Live here today, very interesting stuff coming out of Florida related to a pretty substantial former recruit who's apparently now entering his name in the transfer portal. Matt Zenitz from AL.com brings us this. Of course, Matt's usually very good at all this kind of stuff. Let me show you what Matt had to put out there on Twitter just here today over the course of the last 24 hours. Matt saying that he's learned that Florida redshirt freshman defensive back Jahari Rogers entering the transfer portal, a former top 100 recruit, as Matt points out there. And in this particular case, what some of the Florida media folks are saying, that in Rogers' case, he was hoping to get that starting nod, hoping to be at the top of the depth chart at the end of spring practice. Maybe that's not currently the case for him. Maybe that's why he's choosing to enter the transfer portal right now. But for a Florida team that has certainly taken in its share of big-time transfers and gotten big-time contributions from many of them, obviously expecting that from Bowman, the running back, here this upcoming year. You think about Justin Shorter, the former five-star that came in from Penn State. You can kind of rattle off a lot of these transfers that Dan Mullen has brought in. But when the transfer portal giveth, apparently the transfer portal also taketh away there. And as Tony Barnhart said, Mr. College Football just a couple of moments ago, whether Rogers is gone somehow, some way, the depth that's needed to be established there by the Gators defensively, big spotlight on Todd Grantham. The Florida fans themselves were some of the ones most critical of Florida coach Dan Mullen's decision to bring back Grantham for the upcoming year. They didn't like that. They didn't like the way Florida played late in the season when the embarrassing bowl loss to Oklahoma, obviously keeping it close offensively to Alabama in the SEC championship, but essentially allowing Alabama to score anytime it wanted to on the other side of the ball, even some of the defensive breakdowns in the game against LSU. This is a Grantham-led Florida defense that did not play well near the end of last year, and big spotlight on him to change that this upcoming season, or more questions going to be asked to Dan Mullen why he didn't make the switch at DC when he had a chance to. So Jahari Rogers, apparently a former like number 85 recruit in the country, a guy who was rated in the top 100, that is a guy that Florida won't be able to employ from the depth standpoint there. So a little bit of transfer portal news when it comes to the Florida Gators. Keep dropping your comments here on both our Facebook and our SEC Country Live YouTube page. We'll do this show each and every Wednesday at 3 p.m., reacting to all the big news around the SEC, a chance to find out what's going on in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, a chance to find out what's going on in Athens, Georgia, and College Station, Texas, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Auburn earlier with the former Auburn quarterback Stan White joining the show every Wednesday at 3 p.m. It's our goal to kind of bring you the best of the SEC news from that week right here. And, of course, your contribution, a big part of this. We love the back and forth. You guys, ripping me in the comment section or ripping each other in the comment section, kind of however all that kind of goes down. It's just part of the fun that takes place around SEC football. With that in mind, let's keep our APB going here for a moment, checking in on more of kind of the big news around the SEC. And when Tony Barnhart was with us a moment ago, we talked about the outlook for the first-year coaches in the SEC and the challenge facing Josh Heupel there at Tennessee. Heupel may just not quite be ready for this yet. I mean, he may just be trying to, try on his daddy's suit here in terms of this is just not quite the level of college football that he's ready to be a head coach at. And unfortunately for him, as he tries to kind of grow into this role there at Tennessee, he does so this year with a roster. I think I saw on Twitter the other day or social media somewhere that they may only have like 69, 70 players under scholarship right now. So a lot of roster spots for Tennessee at the moment are going unfilled. So here's the question for the Vols fans who are watching right now, and I thought this was kind of a good point brought up by Brandon Marcello from 24/7 Sports the other day. So for some of these guys who at one point in time said they wanted to transfer out of the program, and for fans, there's this mindset of, and sometimes coaches too, although coaches don't talk about this publicly quite as much, but sometimes there's this thought of, well, if this guy don't want to be here, we don't want him here. That's the kind of chatter that kind of comes up from time to time. But at Tennessee, you may be tempted to say that from some of your guys who, upon Jeremy Pruitt's firing, said, all right, I'm out the door here. But you may look around and say, we got so many holes in this roster, we want to bring some of these guys back. Two names in particular that Brandon Marcello wrote about the other day at 247sports.com. I want to read this quote to you from Brandon talking about the potential need here to welcome some folks back into the fold. What Brandon writes for 247 Sports is that the 2-month soap opera involving Tennessee linebackers Henry Toto, and I know I butchered his last name, I certainly don't do that intentionally, and Quavaris Couch could feature another twist. Marcello writes that the new Tennessee coach Josh Heupel told 247 Sports last Wednesday he hasn't ruled out the possibility of either star player withdrawing from the NCAA's transfer portal and returning to Tennessee. That is Brandon Marcello from 247 Sports. Here's what we know. We know that the current landscape around college football creates some sort of strange dynamic where guys are kind of, bouncing around, moving around a lot, and sometimes a lot of fans don't like that. But in the case of the Tennessee Vols, bringing these guys back, and if they have a chance to do that, and filling some holes in rosters with, in the case of Crouch and Toto, two guys who are certainly capable players and, put up some, numbers, at least in the case of Toto, put up, pretty good numbers all the way around there, that if you're Tennessee, you might not have much choice other than welcoming these guys back right now. So I think for Vols fans, that probably creates a little bit of an interesting dilemma there. And I know that Tennessee fans will look forward to weighing in on that on our comment section here as part of SEC Country Live on both Facebook and YouTube. Let's keep it going here with a couple of other stories, and then we'll get a comment there from you in our Facebook and YouTube comment section before we're done. Let's talk about the Auburn Tigers here for a moment, where Auburn coach Brian Harsin, we talked about a little earlier, is also talking right now about the possibility that he may take a player kind of known for doing one thing and slide him over, and he may be doing something else. Are you familiar with A.J. Pigus, the very impressive tight end, big guy, 300-plus pounder for the Auburn Tigers? What Harsin is saying is, much the same way that Brandon Marcello there was talking about for Tennessee, you're shifting guys around, you're bringing guys back out of the transfer portal, you're doing whatever you can to fill your roster. What Josh Vitale puts out on Twitter is that Brian Harsin, when it comes to J.J. Pigus, doing a completely different idea, saying that he's a physical player, a physical presence, and maybe a guy we can use in any phase of the game. In other words, saying he's going to play offense for us, going to play special teams for us, and maybe actually playing defense there as well. Interesting report from Josh Vitale. Brian Harsin talking about this in a press conference about a week ago, that a big 300-plus pound tight end may also be playing a little defense there for the Auburn Tigers. So very, very interesting to look at these new coaches, new spots, trying to do what they can to fill rosters and trying to get all that done. Obviously, Auburn fans are paying really close attention to that. And then finally there's this, as a part of our All Points Bulletin today, as we bounce around the rest of the SEC. On last week's show, we talked to you a little bit about what Alabama was doing in wake of the news that Jay Graham, the special teams and tight ends coach, was out of a job there. And we later found out that Graham left that job because of some, as he described it, mental health issues, things like that. So Alabama apparently working hard to make this replacement, according to what Football Scoop has put out there. Football Scoop is the website that kind of covers all of these, coaching rumblings. They used to be called Coaching Search. That's kind of the thing they're kind of known for doing. And what they let us know is that the replacement for Jay Graham may have been identified. Drew Svoboda, who's special teams coach most recently at Memphis, kind of just taking that job after having come over from Rice, a guy that's got some ties to the Texas recruiting scene. That's kind of what Alabama had before in this spot. And so now Svoboda may be stepping in for Jay Graham, who was most recently Tennessee running backs coach before kind of coming over to Alabama here, but having to step away from the Alabama program. It sounds like, according to Football Scoop, Alabama has identified its next guy at that spot with Drew Svoboda, which is not an easy name for me to say either, potentially taking over there for Graham there in that role. That is our All Points Bulletin. We're going to check in around the SEC about the big things going on, and, of course, a lot of folks reacting to that in our comment section there as well. We do it every Wednesday at 3 p.m. here on SEC Country Live. We certainly appreciate you being with us. I hope you enjoy the upcoming week. And by the way, speaking of that, as we head towards Easter and we get ready to enjoy a good weekend, for our SEC LOL today, kind of a light-hearted way to finish it off, I thought this was really kind of cool coming from Columbia, South Carolina, where one of their assistants, Justin Stepp, showing this off on Twitter, that Shane Beamer has brought back a tradition that maybe existed at South Carolina prior to the Will Muschamp era of the coaching staff Easter egg hunt right there at Williams-Brice Stadium. a chance to enjoy some time with family. You see the South Carolina mascot there. I think that's really cool. First of all, I think that stadiums like that should be used for as many different things as you can. You've got like Top Golf touring around some of these college football stadiums this offseason, and the South Carolina coaches using the stadium for an Easter egg hunt right there. I think all that's really fun. So good job by South Carolina doing that. I think that's a pretty fun thing to be able to see. I appreciate you being here as a part of SEC Country Live here today. We'll look forward to taking a lot more of your comments, the conversation continuing, and, of course, back here again next Wednesday for everything going on around the SEC. It's SEC Country Live. We'll see you again next week, everybody.